is that darn karate Jew? They're making us rabbinites look horrible. Shalom and welcome again to another exciting edition of the Torah Watchman Show. Hosted by none other than your humble karate host, Rev ben-Emmett, at least the way I've been named by the Ugandan Jews. Yes, people, I talk to Orthodox rabbis about Jews in Uganda. They immediately say, Uganda is Africa, right? Yeah. And they're blacks there, right? Yeah. They're not Jewish. Really? I got into a discussion with someone interested in Judaism today on Facebook, for instance. And he was asking me questions, was King David, did he have red hair like I do? You know, how do I know the Benjamites looked like back then? But I was quick to point out that in tribal Israel, in ancient Israel, when we're not ashamed to be referred to by the rest of the world as Hebrews, right? We would be perceived as colored people in today's society and culture in 21st century. We really would. You know, over a period of time of intermarriage and moving in different places around the world in the diaspora, our physical characteristics changed as we adapted to new areas of the world and different climates and everything else like that. Anyway, I just thought I would share that with you. I just thought it was interesting, if not a little bit funny. No, Moshe did not look like this Jew here. I wouldn't think he would be called a Caucasian. Back then, Hebrews were a Semitic race of people. Let's get that out of the way. Yeah. And this Torah Watchman show, we're talking about Parshah Shemot. That is beginning the first chapter of Exodus. Yes, probably the most famous book in the 5 books of Torah for the largest majority of people, simply because of all the movies been made in the past on the Ten Commandments story, the writings of Josephus, just so much information about the greatest of all prophets, Moshe, than any other individual in the entire Bible. It really is. So let's get started. Our content here is Exodus chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 1. It's a rather long parsha, but I'm going to do my best to summarize the most critical points for your listening pleasure and breaking it out traditionally in 7 aliyahs. So as a brief synopsis, okay, in this week's reading, Shemot begins the book of Exodus. Shemot literally means names. Close to Shem, which means name. Shemot is a derivative of that, okay? And it's talking about the names of tribal Israel, the names that God referred to himself from the patriarchs and matriarchs of blessed memory, when God first reveals his secret name to Moshe. That's what we're talking about. So we pick up in this parsha, I would say approximately roughly 200 or so years after the death of Joseph, who was the viceroy, second only to the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt himself. Well, change of command, things change over several generations. The Jewish people, even though they grew in great multitude and great numbers, in the land of Goshen, the most fertile plains there that were given to them by the Pharaoh, the time of Joseph, who was sympathetic to the Jewish people at that time, because they saved the entire kingdom of Egypt because of the wisdom of Joseph. But the king of Egypt in the time of Joseph had to listen to Joseph and believe in things that he did not hear from his necromancers, his witches, his warlocks, his priests. All these people, all the polytheistic evil people, could not come up with a solution to solve Egypt's famine question. But here we are now, 200 years in the future. A lot of things happen in 200 years. People die, right? So the original chieftains of the 12 tribes, of course, they passed away, and they've had many generations of sons and daughters. And that's where we're at right now. Now, Moshe, a quick synopsis here. As you know, Moshe was not a typical Jew. He was very unique, and he was worth saving because, during that time, there was an execution order that was placed by the king of Egypt at that time, in the time of Moshe, that he wanted to kill all the firstborn of the male children to try to diminish the growing numbers. He was afraid of an army growing within his own kingdom that could eventually start an insurrection and supplant his rule there. So that's what he was concerned about at that time. When Moshe escaped that death sentence, a lot of the boys' sons did not. A lot of them were saved. Moshe was the one that was saved through the ingeniousness of his mother and his sister Miriam, putting him in a basket quickly and put him in the Sea of Reeds, the river Nile, where a princess actually found this child who could not have a child of their own. And Moshe grew up under the Egyptian royalty, essentially, as a surrogate prince of Egypt. Yes. And the writing of Josephus goes into a little bit of more embellishments with this than what's not in the Torah. And all we care about was in the Torah, right? You can watch a movie on the Ten Commandments, Charlton Heston, you want to see some more embellishments. But right now, when we teach the Torah, and the teacher book is what the Torah is all about, is teaching the divine truths and words of God. And I will not go out on a tangent like you hear in the Talmud and Rashi and the others there. I will not go out there with all those embellishments. I wanted to stick right through the Torah study. Incidentally, I have a lot of problems with Chabad. Some problems with the Rebbe Sneerson. That's not germane, but they do a great thing in teaching the Jewish population throughout the world. They really do. They have some of the best resources you can download to Apple Play Store or whatever, Android phone, and just read the Torah and all of that. I do get a lot of resources of that, My Jewish Learning, Sophia, and some of the others out there. That's where I get a lot of my resources from. Of course, I read the Chumash and other resources too. Okay, so we're beginning in chapter 1, and I'm going to read you verse 8. A new king rose over Egypt who did not know about Joseph. Now, what does that mean? Did not know about Joseph. Now, unless someone completely wiped out the history of Egypt in that 200 years, why was the new king, the new Pharaoh of Egypt, totally oblivious of the legacy of Joseph? But he did not only did he not know and acknowledge that Joseph existed, or that he was worthy of any kind of renown, like a sphinx or a pyramid or something like this. He was pretty much in a sarcophagus, and he was kept by the Jewish people in Goshen at that time, because his last will and testament will be carried to the promised land one day when you go there. But this Pharaoh did not know Joseph, and he did not recognize his authority that he had 200 years ago. He was an entirely different personality. Even in the United States, we have good presidents, we have very bad presidents. And in Russia and other countries like that, in China, you have dictators. Then you have more moderate kind of people. Well, this is just how it is in humanity, right? So in verse 9, he said to the people, his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel, which he so named them Hebrews, who is very unique. When Joseph originally went into Egypt and sold into Egypt by the Midianite slavers, he was referred to as a Hebrew. As the first time that is mentioned per se in the book of Bereshit in Genesis. But the Pharaoh was clearly concerned about how numerous the Jewish people had become compared to the men or boys, Egyptian boys that were being born. I mean, he was very concerned. And anyone of any common sense, if you had a group of minorities within your nation, and there were your slave force, and there were your worker bees per se, and then you saw how they were just outnumbering just by the tens of thousands more than the Egyptian women could have children in the same time frame, of course you'd be concerned. This is something we talk about in America. It's something we talk about in France and Germany and other countries. Said, wait a minute. We allowed way too many migrants into our nation. We need to slow it down. You know, eventually, as white as I am and Caucasian I am, they say statistically, the white people, Caucasians, whatever, white Jews could be a minority in the United States. So this is what we're happening here. A minority, an ethnic minority, religious minority was becoming a majority population. It was a threat, at least according to Pharaoh, a real threat. So the first aliyah, again, as recap, all of Yaakov's sons had died, the original chieftains, okay? They probably lived close to 100 years of age, maybe 120 years of age. Does not really say. It does not have the detail there that Yehuda died on this day, or Simon, or Reuben died on this day, or Don, or Gad, or the others. It does not say that. It's not really important. What's important is that their tribe sustained itself through progeny and having children and furthering that tribal subgroup of Jews or Hebrews, okay? Now, the Pharaoh had identified an Israelite problem. Israelite in Hebrew here is used synonymously. It really is, okay? Of course, Israelite is what we referred to the Hebrews back then, today. Rabbis don't use the word Hebrew anymore. You would have to go back in our history, 1930s, and look at these old passports, and I've seen a few of them. You can Google them, I believe, and find them, that essentially talk about race is Hebrew. We don't do that because rabbis are afraid of being evidently targeted the way that what Hitler did during the Holocaust time. Okay? It is a sad indictment against our people that we have moved so far away from our tribal roots, right? At least that's how I feel, okay? So in the first aliyah, the Israelite problem, the Pharaoh identified this as such. His final solution does sound familiar. Yes, it is anti-Semitism, it is bigotry, and it infers to the subject of genocide against the Jewish people. And it's the same thing that Hitler said. I have an Israelite problem. I have a Hebrew problem in the motherland or whatever. You know, I have to do something about this. This is the same thing here that the Pharaoh was speaking. And the adversary was working with the Pharaoh big time here. There was not very much virtue left in this person's character. He was an evil person, and he had delusions of grandeur, and he perceived himself as at least as a demigod or God in itself in Egypt, and so did the Egyptian people. Gave him that same kind of tribute. So what he said was law of the land. So what happened is that he studied the problem in detail. He noticed that the Hebrew women that were having his children had a helper that the Egyptians did not have, known as a midwife, okay, or a wet nurse, that they called them. And in other words, they helped quickly facilitate childbirth and the cleanup afterwards, and disease containment and things of this nature, to make sure the new baby that was born to have a fighting chance to survive. Okay, so this was Hebrew culture, and this is how they treated their young. They did not make as many assumptions as the Egyptian women did. Okay. Now, what the Pharaoh had implemented to do, stage one, to deal with his Israelite problem, was not to eradicate his workforce per se, but to use heavy slave labor against the Hebrew population. In other words, to break their backs literally, to build some of the greatest cities in the history of Egypt, like the cities of Ramses, per se, and many of the others that you can go on a tour to Egypt if you care to do that. Okay, the big treasure cities and other places like that. Well, the Jewish people built that. They built pyramids. They built huge mammoth statues of pharaohs and other things like that. So this slavery, this indentured servitude, this have taskmasters and foremen out there with whips and everything else. The Jewish men, the task to carry huge loads of bricks and everything else, and the straw they used to make bricks. All just use your imagination. But at the same time, the more the Pharaoh beat the Jew down, they had children. Yeah, they made love, and the simcha and everything else. This is how Jews have always dealt with adversity upon them. They had their faith in a greater power other than the government. And that's what we're talking about here. And these righteous midwives were distinguished by the Lord their God. These are Hebrew women, and they're probably older women, probably bubbies and grandmothers and things like that. And they were volunteering to do this. I don't know if they were paid a stipend for doing this. I don't know. But essentially, the Pharaoh was using them to track how many children were being born versus how many female children. And he had an edict there. I want you to kill if it's born a male, I want you to kill them. Okay? Now, the midwives had more faith in their God than some of the men did. They were brave. They were courageous. I'm not saying this. The Torah says this. And God will eventually reward these righteous Eshekil, these Hebrew midwives, for what they did. Okay? Verse 18, so the king of Egypt, and the Pharaoh is synonymously is referred to as the king and as the Pharaoh at the same time. And by the way, the Torah does not give a name of this Pharaoh. Now, in the writings of Josephus, and you see in the movies, the Charlton Heston Ten Commandments, my favorite all-time movie, really is, okay? They refer to him as Ramses. Well, because they had a city there named after someone's name, or past king or pharaoh, or just use the word Ramses. Well, they looked at him as probably being Ramses the first, Ramses the second. I'm not sure. Okay, I'll have some pictures posted back here behind me, so you can see for yourself what recent archaeological digs and evidence point to the correct identity of this pharaoh. But at this time, I would just know the difference between the Pharaoh of Joseph and the Pharaoh of Moshe. Okay? So the king of Egypt asked the most obvious question to the midwives. Why did you disobey me? And again, these ingenious women made up an excuse. He said, as soon as we got to the women, to the mothers that were birthing these children, the babies were missing. So if it was a boy baby, we could not find a child. We could not locate it. They were having children so quickly that we could not identify them. It's strange how the Pharaoh did not execute these women for disobeying a direct order, because he was the king and usually got his way. An angel of the Lord probably softened his heart just a bit about these courageous women. The second hour of the hour, Pharaoh called the midwives to this task of following orders. He brought them out to summon them before his court, asked them these questions because, this was an anomaly. I mean, the Egyptians were without a recourse here. They could not explain why Hebrew women were more fertile than equivalent Egyptian women, and why it was hard, so difficult, like a census or counting, new children in a population of your workforce, why it was so difficult to keep track of this and monitor this very dynamic situation. Well, Elohim had promised I would make the Jewish people fruitful and multiply and become very strong, very powerful, and be able to stand on their own. And this is part of the promises that Elohim had made to Yaakov before he died, okay? But the edict was made that all the firstborn would die. Something interesting in the Torah here, you see in a movie, The Ten Commandments, of Charlton Heston, it has the Pharaoh had dispatched soldiers with swords to kill the children. And there's also legend and story that they simply threw the children into the Nile and had the crocodiles eat them, whatever. But I read this over and over again. Essentially, it was the problem, the diatribe per se, the dialogue was strictly between the court of the Pharaoh, maybe soldiers who had informationally worked with the midwives for quite some time for tracking the workforce and the population and everything else. But, it just didn't work out the way the Pharaoh had desired. But the fact that Moshe's mother put him in a basket of reeds per se, and I guess they had tar or something like that, a way to waterproof it and seal it. Miriam was very instrumental in this, the older sister there. And at the same time, the mother and her daughter worked very carefully, very quickly, to put Moshe in a basket, hide him, and I guess God sent an angel to keep him from crying out, and put him on the river, and pretty much, let God, let the angels take care of this child. But Miriam took upon herself, maybe her mother gave her a tip, I don't know, and followed the basket where it drifted. Now, this was probably strategically placed fairly close to the court of Pharaoh, in that some of the women Egyptian women were bathing near the water, would see this child and respond and possibly save its life, and it's exactly what happened. Now, the Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe, and evidently she had problems being fertile. She did not have a child of her own. And she was praying to the gods for a child, and there you go, a basket of reeds. She heard crying or muffled crying or sounds within that, and she knew that the basket was probably one of the Hebrew mothers that were trying to escape her father's edict against the boy children. She rescued this child and named this child Moshe, for she drew him out of the reeds, drew him out of the water. Essentially is what that word means. It worked out quite well here because, if you're a woman, childbirthing age, and you can't have a child, you're not going to be able to make milk for an adopted child, right? So Miriam probably introduced herself. You said, hey, this child is yours. You can have this child. But I know someone that can help you feed the child. So they worked out an agreement, secret agreement, classified per se, so that the Pharaoh would not know anything about this. I don't know if there were sworn testimonies, because there were witnesses there. Maybe she used her rank and prestige as a daughter of Pharaoh to send away the other servants and other women there at the time. I'm not sure. The details not in the Torah. It's not germane. The main thing is that Moshe was put upon the river Nile, the so-called Sea of Reeds per se, and was drifted off to the Pharaoh's court, in which he was rescued by the Pharaoh's daughter. Okay? So one thing led to another. And now we're in chapter 2, and I'm going to read you in the second aliyah, verse 11, approaching the third aliyah. Now it came to pass in those days that Moshe grew up and went out to his brothers and lifted their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian man striking a Hebrew man of his brothers. Now this paragraph says a lot. First of all, it says that Moshe looked upon the burden of his brothers. In other words, his brethren, his kin, his countrymen. Okay? So Moshe definitely knew who he was. He knew his Hebrew. He knew he was not born Egyptian, and he knew he was born of a Hebrew mother. Now, when he saw injustice among his people, of course he became incensed, he became angry, and he wanted to defend the helpless. This is character, folks. This is virtue, folks. And the young prince of Egypt was Moshe. He grew up in academia within the court of Egypt. He spoke fluent Egyptian, probably Phoenician and other languages, Ethiopian. He probably knew Hebrew, the language and dialect that was used at the time among the Jewish people. He probably was very intelligent. He probably went to their war college, per se. Who knows? But writings of Josephus talks about some of this. Okay, I'm not going to get into any more than that, but just use logical supposition that if you were raised up, even as an adopted son, in a wealthy, affluent family, per se, of a king, of course you'll be afforded more than you would be if you were among your countrymen. Hence the injustices there. So third aliyah, we go into more detail about Moshe being raised under the court and supervision of the Pharaoh. That was essentially his stepfather. Okay, it does not say in the Torah too much about the father Moshe. Some of the midrashic writings talk about that actually the first father that had Aaron and Miriam had died or been killed, and then the second father, who was not predominantly even mentioned there, had Miriam or had Aaron. We're not sure. Maybe Aaron is from the first father, maybe Miriam's from the second father, who is not discussed at all. Just the mother and her daughter Miriam were mentioned in the Torah. Okay? Now, the injustice built upon a climax to a point where Moshe was looking around and making sure no one was watching him, and maybe it was a precipice or something. You see skyscrapers and very tall buildings and people that clean those windows. I would never go up on that thing. I'm scared of heights. And you can imagine going up on a scaffolding and all this, where you make adjustments to the faces of statues or repair bricks and all this. Anyway, something was higher than the ground, in which Moshe took it upon himself and killed the Egyptian taskmaster that was punishing severely maybe an elderly man that could not defend himself. Well, it says right here that he lost his balance or he fell to his death in the sand, and then Moshe quickly buried the body. But he heard rumors when people were talking. He said when he started monitoring the workforce on behalf of Pharaoh, maybe that was one of his roles of job, to check to make sure the soldiers were doing their work, make sure the foremen were doing their work, make sure the correct tally of bricks and everything was being produced. Who knows, etc., etc. But he probably had other discussions with other Egyptians about the severe, harsh treatment of the Jews. Well, one thing led to another. People did indeed hear about what happened with the dead Egyptian that he had murdered. I don't know if it's second or third degree homicide, who knows? But then he became afraid, and he knew that his life was in danger, and he used his diplomatic status, whatever, in Egypt, and he left Egypt as quickly as he could. And that's where we're going out in the third aliyah. Now, he escaped to the land of Midian. And where's the land of Midian? I'll show you a map here. The land of Midian, the Sinai Peninsula next to the Red Sea, as displayed on the map behind me, you can see the approximate location of the land of Midian, at least in the biblical times of Moshe, which is the southwestern coastline of the Sinai Peninsula. The Midianites were, of course, the people that lived in this mountainous region. Where Moshe escaped to, you can imagine the trekker going across the desert sand. Maybe it's hot in the heat of summer, who knows, but God protected him like any prophet. Maybe God gave him honey and locusts, it doesn't say. But he did make it to Midian. And he met a young lady by the name of Tzipporah. Well, this was the eldest daughter of the polytheistic, at that time, priest of Midian, which was known as Jethro. And he actually had many different names, about 6 different names. I'm not going to get into that, what he was called, because he went through different statuses and things like that. And he was known by different peoples in there. He was almost like an ambassador, a chieftain over his tribe. And it does not say anything about him having any sons, just a lot of daughters. Sometimes that happened, okay? Well, what happened is that Moshe fell in love with Tzipporah. You can just use your imagination. Did they have a Tanaim ceremony, engagement, ketubah, marriage agreement? Who knows in an ancient land there what they did to get married, but they got hitched and they had a child fairly soon after they got married. His name was Gershom. So back in Egypt, meanwhile, the plight of the Israelite slaves was worsening. The situation was worsening. They were praying for a Mashiach. No deliverer there. Pharaoh, the taskmaster, increasing their whip, demanding their tally to be increased, even though they took away their resources, probably did not feed them as much, made their lives absolutely miserable. This is exactly the state of affairs of Jews throughout the history living in a diaspora under the leadership of evil people. Essentially, that's what it reminded me of. Chapter 3, Moshe was pasturing in the flocks of Jethro. And that was essentially, he had a new job, okay? I don't know if he gave away his Egyptian clothes, Egyptian sandals, whatever, but it seemed like he was at peace with himself. He was in the valley with Mount Sinai, mountain range off in the background per se. You can just picture this. I have photographs here and images here to show you, but he was over here tending the sheep, making probably lots of money for his father-in-law, loved his wife, loved his son, living a very idyllic life there, okay? But his mind was always on Egypt. His mind was always on the Hebrew people and their suffering. Of course, he knew about his mother, and he knew about his brother, and he knew about his sister as well, okay? So something led him to the mountain of God known as Horeb. Now, this is the burning bush incident we're getting to. In the fourth of the hour. Now, Moshe was shepherding Jethro's flocks in the wilderness when he finally arrived at the foot of the mountain of God, which is Mount Sinai. He saw a bush off in the distance. Now, if you ever been in the desert Southwest or Texas like I have before, they have mesquite trees there, and the wood and everything else is very useful for kindling, for starting a fire. Well, this was a desert plant, a desert bush, and I guess there were no lightning storms or anything like that could have sparked a flame within it. But this bush was burning, visible, a flame, but you did not smell any smoke. There was no sign of combustion happening, but you visibly saw like a torch, like a lighthouse with a signal there that caught Moshe's eye, that led him all the way to the foot of the Mount Horeb, which is probably adjacent to Mount Sinai. And he probably asked Jethro and others, his wife, about what is this mountain range called? What is this about? He said, that's a mountain of God. And, the embellishments and writing Josephus, supposedly no one could go up to that mountain without fear of dying. And to this day, that whole mountain range is protected by Muslims and Arabs, and no Jews are allowed to go there, and they consider it as a very holy, sacred site in Islam. Okay, but no rabbi gives it a second thought. You know, it is what it is. I don't want to go there. But God was there waiting on him. You know, I wanted to say this, and I get on the main message here, is that what if Moshe did not look up and see that light? There's no indication in Torah there was a shofar blast, no indication there was a clap of lightning, the thunder, whatever. There was nothing, wolf howling, nothing got his attention other than he was tending his sheep and he saw this distant light. And it touched his heart in such a way he knew something was unusual about that light. And I tell people all the time, I have an astronomy background. I look up a lot, and I like to look at the moon's phases and correlate that to the actual passage of time and a month and everything else. You can actually estimate, 50% of the moon illuminated, of consumption of the phases and everything, moving on to end the month and everything else, and the beginning of the new moon, Rosh Chodesh and all of this. But for me to look up, I'm thinking less of myself than looking down. And this is what Moshe did. He looked up to see God in the midst of that mountain, manifested in a bush that was burning, but it was not being consumed. No smoke, no ashes. You smelled a burning fire before. You know how it stinks and smells from far away, but there was no indication of that happening. It says Elohim called out to him. So when he got close to the bush, and maybe he decided to walk back. Maybe I should not go here. Maybe Jethro was right. Maybe I will die if I get here too close. But he heard a voice, Moshe, 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 come to me, come to me. So he inclined the voice and went up to the bush, and then God gave him a message that he wanted to hear. But he did not know what to do with that message. He took his shoes off because it was holy ground. God said, remove your sandals. This is holy ground. He got to his knees like a lot of Cardi Jews do. He wasn't bending his knees back and forth like a lot of Orthodox do. He got on his face before his God, took off his shoes. And when Cardi Jews prayed, this is what we do too, because we are in the midst of the King of the universe, the divine creator. And God was speaking to him. And Moshe said, who are you? He was an unknown to him. I mean, it was almost mythical, the God of his ancestors. And a lot of people in the Holocaust chose not to believe in God anymore because of the horrible, horrific things that happened during the Holocaust. Why would a loving God allow such horrible things? And then you might say, why would a loving God allow my people, Israel, to suffer so much in Egyptian bondage? Well, God was very clear, and he told Moshe, I'm very aware of the affliction of my people, and I'm going to do something about it. And I know what's happening with the taskmasters. I know the pain and misery of every whip that strikes the back of a Jew. I know when they have hunger in their bellies. I know when the mothers are crying for their lost children. I know what's happening. I've heard their cries for deliverance. So God had commended Moshe to go after giving him certain indelible signs that God indeed would be with him, and God would send him a helper to help him deliver his message to Egypt. Okay? In chapter 3, these are the instructions. I'll read the verses here, 16 at least. It says, go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord God of your forefathers had appeared to me, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Yaakov. This is the first time those phrases were used in a prayer, intimate prayer between a human being and the divine creator. And, Moshe is asking, who are you? What is your name? Essentially he says, I will be that I will be. Essentially, that second name, Jehovah, and some Christians say Yahweh, but Jehovah, I am the pre-existent one. I have always existed. The same promises I made to your forefathers, the same promises I'm making to you. I was emet truth to Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov. I'm the same emet truth to you. If you, just as they trusted in me and my covenantal promises, and I never lied to them, I was always with them, I will be there with you. Now that legend and story passed down between Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov stayed with Moshe and probably heard about this among his people when he probably visited with them and growing up in Egypt. I'm not sure. I don't have any details of this. But Elohim said, I surely remember my promises I made to Israel. When you go back to Egypt, I'll be with you. Okay? Then the fifth aliyah, Elohim gave Moshe specific instructions, was to gather the Israelite elders to inform the God. Now, at this time, when Moshe went back to Egypt, the people that wanted to kill him, the Pharaoh that had the capital punishment edict on his head, they had all died. And maybe when a king dies, so did the edicts. And he came back there as a Midianite, maybe as a diplomat status, I'm not sure. Maybe on behalf of Jethro, was definitely had diplomatic status, the court of Egypt, because he represented a foreign people, But he did come back, and he was not arrested at the gates. God was with him. And Moshe went straight to his brother Aaron about this, okay? So everything that was conveyed to Moshe by God, all the talking points with his father-in-law, Jethro, his marriage commitment to Tzipporah, and his son Gershom, he made all of this known. And Jethro gave him all the best wishes in the world. He was survived. He was surprised that his son-in-law survived going to the mountain because it was forbidden for anyone to go there. By his own religious faith, it was forbidden. But he went there and came back with a message. And then Jethro said salam, essentially shalom. The sixth aliyah, Moshe took his wife and 2 sons and headed for Egypt. He was responsible for his marriage, responsible for his children. So that was his intent when he left the household of Jethro in the land of Midian. God had charged Moses to warn Pharaoh. So said God, my firstborn son is Israel, the servant of Yaakov. So I say to you, send out my son so that he will worship me. This is the first time, I believe, the servant of Yaakov, Yaakov's name transformed to Israel before he died, and referring to all of the nation of Israel as his firstborn son, that he always, he never had that human intimacy before with any group of people other than the Hebrews. This is a wonderful, blessed way to refer to Israel. Very tender, loving, as a father and as a mother, reaching out to these hurting people. I want my son to come out of Egypt and worship me. Okay. Now, if you refuse to send them out, and this is Moshe speaking through Aaron. Remember the diatribe and dialogue between Elohim and Moshe. He says, I stutter, I cannot speak, I'm nervous speech or whatever. And God had given him a helper, his older brother Aaron, to speak on his behalf. And Aaron was speaking a lot of this dialogue on behalf of Moshe before the court of Pharaoh, the new Pharaoh, okay? So Moshe had met with Aaron and greeted him together in Egypt and gathered the elders to perform the wondrous signs that God had given Moshe. So this began a series of signs and tests that we all go through during Pesach, during Passover all the time. like turning the river Nile to blood, and every vase of water, fresh water that benefited Egyptians, they turned to undrinkable blood, but nothing was touched in Goshen. They had plenty of fresh water. They had urban wells that worked fine, and the water supply was not compromised or contaminated the way Pharaoh and the Egyptians were. God was making a distinction between his people, who had the anointing and chosen, against Egyptian people that were in opposition to God's plan, and bringing his son out of Egypt and to the desert in a dedicated place to worship him. Okay? Chapter 5, and I'll read verse 1 quickly. We're getting close to the seventh aliyah. And afterwards Moshe and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, "So said the Lord God of Israel, send out my people and let them sacrifice to me in the desert." Now, what are they going to sacrifice? Sheep. Now, sheep was a sacred animal in Egypt and was considered to be godlike. Okay? It was capital punishment for you to harm a sheep. And this was the discussions that Moshe was explaining to Pharaoh. He said, okay, take away these plagues, take away these things, worship whatever you need to do here. You don't need to go out. And Moshe said, we have to go out. And Pharaoh said, why? He demanded an explanation. Because you don't allow us to sacrifice these animals in your midst. Okay? It's against Egyptian law. So that's very interesting, this commentary here. But this went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. God sent a plague, sent an admonishment against Pharaoh, did the distinction between Hebrews that were not touched by this plague, the Egyptians that were judged by this plague. These were judgments against the gods of Egypt versus the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov. The seventh aliyah, wrapping this parsha up, Moshe and Aaron went to Pharaoh and presented God's demand again. The Pharaoh mocked the request and instructed the Egyptian taskmasters to increase the Israelite slave workload even more beyond what it was. Try to make bricks without straw. In other words, my people will no longer harvest straw for you to make bricks. You have to work in the night. Your women and children too go out and harvest that straw, that hay, for those bricks. So and then the people just, people had enough. Moshe came there with flowery words, did some magical signs there. The Egyptian court did the same thing with the serpent. And when Aaron threw down the staff and everything else, and the necromancers were able to reproduce this, even turning the river Nile River into blood, they could reproduce this to some effect. So the faith of the Jewish people at that time were very on shaky ground. And you have to understand why they were put in slavery in the first place, because they forgot why they were there in the first place. Now the Israelites were unable to meet Pharaoh's new demands, and they were viciously beaten. So even though they did their best humanly possible, they were beaten more. Can you imagine this kind of abuse here, okay? Moshe addressed God. He said, why have you mistreated the people so severely? You sent me here to save them, and now they're more mistreated than before, and they want to stone me. So Pharaoh, he said, since I've come to Pharaoh to speak your name, he has mistreated the people. Your name has not been a blessing to our people, but a curse. It's amazing. Moshe was very frank with the divine creator of this. And he had it standing there because face to face with Elohim, the prophet of Moshe enjoyed, and no other prophet in history enjoyed that kind of opportunity to see God's face and talk to God, whether in a trance or being a night vision or something like this. Now Elohim responded, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a mighty hand he will send them out. So we covered, I've covered a lot here, okay? Moshe was literally saved from the Pharaoh of that time's edict to kill the firstborn of every Hebrew child. Not only was he saved, he was brought up under the wealthy court of Pharaoh and he had all the entitlements and benefits as a prince of Egypt. He traded all of that away to side with his countrymen and defend them. And one thing led to another. He was running away from Egypt for his life. And he lost everything. Inheritance, gold, wealth, whatever, fortune, girls, whatever. Just use your imagination. And he got married, had a child of his own, and had an encounter that changed his life forever. An encounter of Yehovah Allah Hakam and the burning bush opportunity that changed his life. But he needed help like we all do. God sends a helper when we need. Just like in Hanukkah, we have a heifer candle known as the shamash. We use that one candle to light the others. This is how Aaron benefited. He was a benefactor to Moshe, elevated his voice to a level until he could have the same confidence that Aaron had, that Aaron was naturally endowed. Some people are not endowed to be good speakers. The thing is that God, all we have to do, when God calls us, we make ourselves available to God, and then he will figure out a plan and a way to accomplish his task. But you have to look up to see God speaking. You have to answer the phone when God's calling. Don't let him get a busy signal. I hope this Parsha was meaningful to you. It's the beginning of a great series of miracles that will be celebrated in every Pesach. It's been celebrated every Pesach for thousands of years and probably will be celebrated in the time of the Mashiach. The miracles of God and his admonishments against the evil kings of this world and his love for his firstborn son, Israel, that he will hold Israel's back and defend them. This is such a strong message, folks, for what the IDF is doing in Israel today and fighting the terrorists there and the Palestinians and Gaza Strip and Hamas and Hezbollah and all these things. God has not given up his people. God has not turned his face away from his people. Not completely. God has a plan. Moshe became the Mashiach, the Savior into the Jewish people, to save them from a predicament that was beyond their human ability to rescue themselves. This is Rev ben-Emmett signing out until the next time. Remember, please share the knowledge and wealth and love and truth for everyone willing to hear it. A lot of people are very resistant to the truth because, especially men, it holds you accountable, right? Humbles you, right? Will you live that witness? Do not be a hypocrite, especially to your children, and they will follow you. I promise you it will happen that way. All my love and blessing to B'nai Noach and Andhra Pradesh in India and other places in Arizona and up in the Norwegian areas of the world. There are Noahides everywhere. God bless you. I know what you're going through. Your sacrifices are being heard and being noticed by the King of Kings upstairs. And also, my Hardy brothers and sisters, I've tailored these parshas just for you and let you know that I'm on your side and I will defend you. I've left the rabbinate nonsense behind me forever. I'm moving my family to Ashdod, Israel as soon as I humanly can. And I will spend the rest of my days in a Cardi show praising the Lord my God. And my witness and my testimony, hopefully there's deeds and not just empty words. There's more to come about that journey, about the Shuvah journey. Take care. God bless you. Until I see you next time, go to YouTube, Word and Board. Please subscribe and share and personal notify. And I will do another Parsha before you can say, I miss Rev ben-Emmett. Take care.